We are back, and we are joined now by Michael T. Klare, the nation's defense correspondent, professor emeritus of peace and world security studies at Hampshire College, author of All Hell Breaking Loose, the Pentagon's Perspective on Climate Change, and his recent piece in The Nation, Surviving an Era of Pervasive Nuclear Instability. Thank you so much for coming on the show today, Michael.
Of course, I'm happy to be with you.
Happy to be speaking to you. You write in this piece about how the United States is expanding the nuclear arms race and has been for a few years into a three-way competition versus kind of the more Cold War rivalry. China is now being brought into the fold. Speak a bit about that and what that development means and looks like.
So the United States did not think of China as a major nuclear foe until very recently. China had a very small nuclear arsenal, a few hundred nuclear munitions altogether, compared to about 5,000 in the U.S. arsenal. And so it wasn't treated as a major worry. But China has been building up its nuclear arsenal probably in response to growing U.S. military buildup, in the Pacific area, which China finds very threatening and fears that the U.S. might use nuclear weapons. So China has, just in the past few years, expanded its nuclear arsenal. And this has given warhawks in the United States a reason, a justification to accelerate the nuclear buildup already underway.
Can you speak about the expansion of United States presence in and around China's borders and how that began and how that was taken as a provocation that sparked much of this, as you describe?
So the U.S., of course, has historically viewed Russia, before that the Soviet Union, as the greatest threat to American security. But in recent years, as China has developed economically and technologically and so on, the U.S. has come to view China as a greater threat, as a growing threat, and sees it even more so in the future if China continues its military and economic buildup, its rise. And so as the Afghanistan war was dragging on, the Biden administration already made plans to shift the focus of U.S. military planning to the Pacific. And you see new military ties with the Philippines, with South Korea, with Japan, with Australia. All this looks like containment to the Chinese, like the U.S. is trying to surround it with hostile military forces, and created a lot of anxiety. And of course, there's the issue of Taiwan. The U.S. increasingly views Taiwan as an ally, and China views Taiwan as a province of China. So tensions over Taiwan have increased enormously.
Certainly. And we were quite critical on our program of Nancy Pelosi going and visiting there, and quite recklessly, in my opinion, ramping up tensions by going around China to recognize Taiwan in that way, regardless of what you feel about Taiwanese independence. It's just quite an irresponsible provocation in the midst of this kind of new Cold War mentality as it relates to China. And
that kind of provocation continues. Representative Mike Gallagher, who chairs the House Committee on the Communist Party of the People's Republic of China. This is a new committee set up to investigate China and to create legislation that would isolate China and increase U.S. support for Taiwan, is in Taiwan now or just visited or on his way. But he's an outspoken critic of China's claims over Taiwan and calling for more U.S. military aid to to Taiwan. And this is certainly going to stir up tensions again, the way Nancy Pelosi's visit did.
More military aid to Taiwan. What does that mean for China domestically? And since Taiwan is considered a province of Greater China, the United States prioritizing sending them weapons within what China considers their own territory, you can understand why that is maybe something that perhaps the United States shouldn't prioritize.
This is such a contentious issue now in Washington because so many people, both Democrats and Republicans, believe that we should arm Taiwan to the death so that it could fight off a Chinese invasion, or more realistically, the argument goes that Taiwan should be able to hold out for a week or so until the U.S. could enter the fight. Nobody believes that Taiwan could defend itself exclusively on its own, that if a war were to break out between Taiwan and China, the U.S. would inevitably come to its assistance, and then you'd have a major superpower war, the U.S. versus China, which in my mind very likely would end in the use of nuclear weapons.
And I guess that's where we turn to that risk. In your piece, you lay out these I think four or so nuclear flashpoints, 4 or 5, about where further proliferation, nuclear escalation could reemerge in some of these hotspots. We've touched on Taiwan, but you also mentioned Ukraine and NATO expanding and what that means with regards to Russia.
Well, I like you say, I named 4 current nuclear flashpoints. I think there will be more in the future. One is Taiwan, as you say. Another is Europe and the expansion of NATO to include Finland and Sweden, which extends NATO's perimeter to Russia's Arctic region, which is a new area of contestation. And then you have the South China Sea. We don't hear as much about the South China Sea as we do about Taiwan, but this is a very dangerous, precarious area because the Chinese are constantly, well, the Chinese claim the whole area as their territory, which in my mind is a bit of a stretch, but they use their naval forces to bully or to harass fishing boats from the Philippines, from Vietnam, and so on. And the U.S. has pledged to come to the aid of those ships. And there have been repeated clashes between Philippine ships and Chinese ships. And this could be another spark for escalation that could lead to a major U.S.-China war. And then, of course, there's North Korea, which is constantly on the verge of a major clash and the use of nuclear weapons.
Can you expand on that North Korean threat there and basically how it relates to the United States and South Korea?
So, the war between Korea, South Korea, the Republic of Korea, the ROK, and North Korea, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, the DPRK, that conflict never ended. There's just a ceasefire between the two sides and a demilitarized zone, but never a peace treaty. And hostilities have continued ever since. And you have a dynasty in the north, the Kim dynasty, led now by the grandson of the founder of the Kim dynasty, who more than ever relies on nuclear weapons to maintain his legitimacy and to intimidate the population and rally the population. And he's constantly testing new weapons and has threatened to use nuclear weapons against the South if there's any provocation. And the U.S. has 30-something thousand troops there, and they could be involved in a conflict at any moment with the North Korean forces. If there were to be an incident, and these incidents occur all the time, so that could be another location for an incident that sparks the use of nuclear weapons.
Well, the fact that the United States has around 750 military bases across the world per the last count I saw in Responsible Statecraft means that our not just our meddling and interference is all over the place, but that we have literally American troops stationed in so many places that if they are to die in some of these potential flare-ups, that also increases the possibility for incredibly deadly hostilities.
Absolutely, absolutely. My biggest fear, frankly, is that the U.S. Engages in a clash with Chinese naval forces, either off Taiwan or in the South China Sea or near Korea and Japan. And both sides, China and the U.S., constantly have naval maneuvers to, flex their muscles and intimidate the other side. These are going on constantly with U.S. aircraft carriers engaging in combat maneuvers off the coast of China. And the Chinese send out their planes and their ships to try to push the American ships away and vice versa. So these provocative maneuvers that also occur in the air, they're constant, and they could lead to unintended escalation. One side fires at the other side when they get too close, or there's a ramming by one side or the other in the South China Sea. All of these have precedents before, and the maneuvers are increasing in frequency. So that my fear is that an American ship will be sunk in one of these events, or American plane shot down, and then we'll have to retaliate against the Chinese, or it could go the other way around. But, it'll lead to higher and higher levels of escalation until one side or the other feels so threatened they use nuclear weapons. That's my fear, my biggest fear.
I share that fear, and the fact as well that the Biden administration has expanded military bases in the Philippines. They also presided over that arms deal. I forget what the acronym is, but with Australia.
Focus.
Oh, yes, exactly. So, I mean, those are that just increases the likelihood, does it not, over the past few years?
Well, it increases China's fear of encirclement. And the Chinese are proud people. They view this as a insult to their what they consider their legitimate rise to world-class status. And the Xi Jinping regime is feeding this nationalism to rouse the populace of China. So there's a lot of anger at the U.S. for all of these moves, which feel very threatening, and they're responding by building up their forces. But I think that the Biden administration, which, by the way, these tactics began with the Trump administration. So you see continuity between Trump and Biden. Biden has just accelerated what Trump started. And these moves are all very provocative. And if you see them from Beijing's point of view, they're very threatening and call for a response. Imagine if Chinese forces were building up off of the Pacific or the Atlantic coast,
right,
which is exactly what's happening.
Can you speak as well about the threats imposed by, the nuclearization of India and Pakistan?
Well, that's good that you ask, because we don't hear about that very much. But both India and Pakistan are nuclear-armed countries. They're both expanding their nuclear arsenal, then their stockpile of weapons, and their delivery systems. They're increasing the range and capability of their missiles. They both have a very active missile development program. And they both say, but especially Pakistan, which is the weaker of the two, that if they're invaded by India, they will use tactical nuclear weapons at the beginning of a clash between them. If it looks like India is about to overtake their conventional forces and invade and penetrate into Pakistani territory, that they're ready to use nuclear weapons at the start of a conflict. So you have a real worry about some kind of incident or clash on the border triggering that kind of a scenario. And there have been repeated India-Pakistan conflicts, border conflicts over the past decades.
One of the other fears that I've been rattling around in my mind is the fear that the Biden administration seems to be, I'm hoping they're moving away from this, but for a while taking seriously the idea that Saudi Arabia normalizing with Israel and working to be the representatives of the Palestinian people, because hey, they're both Arabs, right? In these peace negotiations could involve a deal that, and this is apparently Mohammed bin Salman's desire, to create a nuclear weapon in Saudi Arabia. My God, that's terrifying. Can you speak about that potentiality?
Oh, yes, I think you're right to be worried about that.
Yeah.
Especially in the present circumstances. Now, the Saudis never talk about acquiring nuclear weapons. They talk about acquiring a complete nuclear fuel cycle. They want to, they claim this is for peaceful purposes, to have a nuclear power capacity in their country, and to have a complete nuclear fuel cycle in the sense that they would produce plutonium for their reactors, conceivably, and have the ability to extract plutonium from their reactors, have that kind of technology, which conceivably would give them the ability to manufacture a nuclear weapon. So up until now, the U.S. government has, and this is against U.S. law, as it's unless there were, there are various loopholes, and I think that the Biden administration's ultimate goal here in the current Mideast crisis is to get Saudi Arabia and Israel to work together for some final solution to the conflict in Gaza. They see that as the only way that there could be a positive outcome. And Saudi Arabia is going to have a list of demands,
Right.
For what they want. And what they want is that nuclear technology that I described that would allow them to theoretically to acquire enough nuclear material to produce a nuclear weapon, which until now they've been denied. But under present circumstances, I can imagine the Biden administration or a future Trump administration giving in and providing them with that technology as a sweetener to sign a peace agreement or some kind of agreement with Israel, and get Netanyahu out of the trap he's currently in.
It's terrifying because that just circumvents all Palestinian sovereignty, and also was a huge reason why Hamas stated they made their attack, right? Because they felt cut out of these kinds of procedures or talks. So that's a whole different rabbit hole that we could go down. But I think you put it quite succinctly. lastly, as we begin to wrap up, how many nuclear weapons are out there at this point? Do we have a good sense? And like, how much has that increased even since Cold War times?
Okay, well, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute publishes an annual survey of the world's nuclear weapons, and it's considered the most reliable in public space. And they say that Russia has about 6,000 warheads, and the U.S. about 5,000 nuclear warheads, something in that order. And France and the UK have somewhere in the vicinity to 200 or 300. India and Pakistan, maybe 200 or so each, and Israel maybe 100. So you could add all of that up. When I say the U.S. has all of those and Russia has all of those nuclear munitions, not all of them are currently deployed or available for immediate use. Some of them are in storage or decommissioned, but available in the event of a heightened crisis. They could be made available for use. Under the current treaty that the U.S. signed with Russia in 2010, the New START Treaty, both sides are limited to 1,550 so-called deployed strategic nuclear weapons on ICBMs and bombers and submarines. And that's the number that both sides have that are ready to go at an instant moment. Both also have hundreds of so-called tactical nuclear weapons for battlefield use. We don't talk about those much, but they're aimed for a war in Europe. So there are quite a lot of nuclear weapons floating around out there.
And truly, lastly here, how can we make denuclearization a more urgent political priority in that way, maybe here in the United States?
I think you have to first inform people and educate people about the level of risk. I think most people are sort of under the impression that the nuclear issue has disappeared since the end of the Cold War. Subsided would be a better word. And that other threats, non-nuclear threats, are more pressing, including the climate. And those are understandable impressions. What I tried to write in my piece for The Nation is that we have to reconsider that impression and understand that the nuclear danger has increased significantly in the past few years and is going to grow enormously in the years ahead as China builds up its arsenal, Russia builds up its arsenal, and the U.S. expands the capacities of its arsenal. And there's a three-way arms race, and there are these flashpoints. So people have to become, understand that the nuclear risk isn't far off some distant horizon. It's moving closer and closer to us, and then take action to reduce that risk.
Well, I agree with you completely and greatly appreciate your time today. Michael T. Klare, the nation's defense correspondent, professor emeritus of peace and world security studies at Hampshire College, and you can read his book, All Hell Breaking Loose, or his recent piece in The Nation, Surviving an Era of Pervasive Nuclear Instability. Thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for giving me this opportunity to raise these issues.